Hello. For episode 180 of the Heirs for Architecture podcast, the extraordinary Australian architect Peter Stutchbury joined me to speak about a little of his work, his origins, his purpose and his ethic. It's an extraordinary story, beautifully told by a wonderful man, a worthy addition for this, a Jubilee episode. Peter's work is deeply rooted in the land and culture of his homeland, and all the complexity that implies. There are histories, cosmologies, manners and methods, which are drawn together in places, and through this, in Peter's telling, the work becomes a means of connection, so that as you find the work, you also find yourself becoming of the work, not in a way that you copy it, or that necessarily makes sense to you, but in a way that allows you to relax and perhaps even not be judgmental, perhaps even to take it with you as part of your entourage. Hot dang, that's quite a way of putting it.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Heirs for Architecture podcast. I'm delighted to be talking today to Peter Stutchbury, Australian architect and general superstar. Peter, thank you for joining me late in your evening and early in my morning.
Pleasure.
Would you be, as my guests do, able to introduce yourself in the most effusive way you like?
Certainly. I'm from a very middle-class background, having spent a lot of time in the outback of Australia and a smaller amount of time on the coast, involved in both situations in activities around nature like surfboard riding, sailing, mustering sheep, tending to land. And I was educated in Sydney, but then went to a regional university because I wasn't brilliant enough to get into the Sydney ones. And but it was fortuitous because it was a wonderful smaller city, very accessible and with a less demanding social fabric to it. So one could explore ideas a lot easier, I felt.
Which one was this?
This is Newcastle University, 100 miles north of Sydney. And then I was very fortunate to meet several great thinkers in my period at university, but one that has stayed with me to this date, Richard Laplastrier, who was a great inspiration in those days and still is. And then, of course, my parents were great teachers as well. My father was an engineer and my mother was she was a philosopher and a musician. And so that combination gave me structure, both structure and poetry to my life, I guess. And I've followed those two streams of belonging to this day. And I'm an architect.
Yes, that's really interesting. Your architecture has been described as, I think it's described you as someone's described you as a lyrical technologist, which kind of brings together both your philosophical and engineering backgrounds, I guess. Do you think that's a fair description?
Well, when I read it, I thought about it a lot, and I thought probably those two words together are the most accurate I've felt about my own work and the work our practice does. The lyrical comes, of course, with imagination, and the practical side is really just a way of being in the world, a way of seeing things and understanding them, which I think then produces a certain honesty to your buildings and honesty to your life.
That's a lovely thing to say. It's a great claim.
Well, not always practiced to its fruition, but practiced as conscientiously as possible.
Yeah, I would like to understand the context. Go back to Sydney and this comment you just made about sort of finding more of a voice on the edge, away from I guess, the dominant atmosphere of Sydney, probably, I'm assuming, for the whole of Australian architecture, it's being the kind of the lodestar for Australian architecture. Is that the case? I mean, obviously it's kind of changed a bit now as things have moved, but what was it like when you were training? This was assume in the 70s?
Yeah, it was mid-70s. Look, I think it is typical of all major cities throughout the world that there's a expectation of place being, in this case, place of education. And there's almost a given stratification of those that are pursuing that particular education. I found it very dominant at school. I went to a singular boys' school, and which was quite terrifying. I found it at times haunting, and I was disturbed by that type of education. So to go to a regional university that had none of that social structure to it, and that had teachers who themselves were discovering things in a less pressured environment, was very beneficial to my development, and really assisted me in freeing up my thinking. I think that freedom was always there, but it hadn't been released, and I think the university released that.
Yes.
Whereas I think in a more structured environment, it may not have happened as easily.
Do you think there's something about moving out of the super urban environments of places like Sydney as well, coming to places where, without wishing to over romanticize it, you can sort of touch the earth, you can sort of land more securely on the land?
Definitely. And definitely when the mind is active and challenged and investigatory, definitely. And those sort of environments allow that to happen with less judgment.
And architecture as an industry is quite disciplinary in a way, isn't it?
Well, ultimately, I think it is. And you really need to look at the sort of majority of office structures throughout the world. And, I'd say the vast majority are very structured businesses. It's becoming more and more difficult for an architect to express true freedom or true imagination. It's the regulatory environment is becoming disturbing, and I was just dealing with it today. With the environmental management of buildings, which I think is a good idea, but it doesn't account for systems, and it doesn't account for the joy of experience. It doesn't account for scale or light, and so to a degree, it's a flawed system.
Yes. Strikes me that flattening that you are implying is part and parcel of the sort of modernist imagination that, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're mentoring by people like Le Plastrier and Mercat is trying to escape. It's trying to create texture and life through a kind of regional contextual precision.
I truly don't think it's a deliberate move, a deliberate attempt to escape. I think it's more a practice of belief, I guess. It's a practice where one understands or one has been involved in the understanding of the environment and patterns, be them climatic or weather or animal or human and respects that more than the indeterminate, the things that you can't put your finger on. You can explain perhaps by beauty, but you can't explain by, for want of a better word, by truth. You can't explain it by accuracy. And I find that area of description for me, of course, there'll always be buildings that are incredibly beautiful without explanation. But I don't think they have infinite time. I think they have certain limitations, whereas there are buildings which you can go into and you can't determine whether they're past, present, or future.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, the Opera House is a very easy example for us to give in Sydney. But there are some beautiful prefabricated, brought from Scotland warehouses that, are equally as, not equally, I wouldn't say, but justifiably beautiful, and I look at your roof structure behind you there and see the work going on, but see a strong, simple form, that could become a beautiful space in the right hands. So I think it's that thing for me anyway. It's the thing of being able, a building in this instance, being able to tell a story, and not just a story of, and not just the fanciful story of colour and rhyme, but a story that goes to the very heart of thinking, to the very sort of beginnings of existence. And I don't mean that in a sort of disturbing way. I mean it in quite a purposeful way.
Is this skill that you're talking about, this type of building, is it something that can be learned? That is to say, is it mimetic? Can it be copied? Because of course, I suppose on one hearing, John Utzon's Opera House, we have a genius at work. A genius working with very, very good engineers. A sort of, I guess, a combination of genius. But not everybody's a genius. So are you saying through things like pattern and through working with a deep knowledge of ecology or, I guess, indigenous kind of norms or practices, it is possible to get to this sort of point as let's call it an ordinary designer, an ordinary architect?
Not sure, but we don't have a lot of truly gifted sports people. And there is a story to there is a story to Utzon. He was gifted, of course, but his education as a young person was rich and a tapestry of different things and patterns but all fundamentally grounded in nature. And my great Aboriginal teacher, Uncle Max Dulaman Harrison, said so simply and so gently, nature is your greatest teacher. And very easy to shrug off as a comment. But I find myself contemplating that more and more as we lose things around us. We lose and we lose the logic of things around us as well. We lose the ability to understand why the plants in a creek are different to the plants on the hill alongside, and why the rocks are exposed in the creek and covered alongside. There's a loss when we sacrifice nature. There's a loss of understanding, there's a loss of time, there's a loss of principles, there's a loss of patterns, there's a loss of all sorts of things. And I don't think we appreciate that loss as much as we should as a race of animals, really.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Your design process, could you talk about that a little bit? I imagine it's very difficult to talk about, though. I was reading a book recently by Nigel Cross on design thinking, and he was talking about interviews that he had done with great designers, Philippe Starck and people like that, people whose design is revered. And as far as I could see, it was very difficult to get to the heart of what it is a designer does that makes their design work. But I'm going to ask you anyway, like, how do you go about this process of, I guess, an embedded form of architecture? Like, is there time on site? Is there an intuition when you wake up in the morning?
For me, it originates from site. I'd say 95% of the time. And one can say, well, what about the sites that are completely urbanized? How do you possibly come up with an idea about site for those? Well, you take the buildings away and you look at the structure of the land and you imagine that place as it might have been. And that gives you the powder to make decisions. And I find that not being an academic, but being a practical person that had to move sheep from A to B in the most efficient and effective way through landscapes, that those decisions, they're difficult because they're architecture. They're not easy, but they have a certain understanding to them, which is about the place. And I'm doing a little house at the moment, and it's between two rivers, and beyond the river is the ocean. So it's on one isthmus, with it looking through another isthmus to the ocean, with the most dynamic mouth of the river that changes all the time opening. And it's very difficult. And we walked up onto the headland. We spent quite a deal of time on site. But slowly I recognised, and I had to take the buildings away, that the power of the river was its movement, and it's unknown. It's a flat plain and you can't see underneath it. So there's a mystery to a river, and how do you discover that? Through a building, but the building is on a floodplain, or a plain that can flood. So then you understand that water comes across your site, and you slowly assemble the story that goes with that site. And then I feel that, maybe it's my training, maybe it's innate, maybe it's just out of practice, that you recognize the activities that might take place logically on that site. And those activities take the form of a building in a funny way. So, they might be, the building might move with the river, emotionally move, obviously not physically move, but emotionally move with the river to take you there. The client loves this river. So it's not like he's looking at it, he is part of it. So I try and take him there with the building. So that's where they all start, really. And they all have an explanation that's similar. And that's what I've practiced. And that's all I know. So, and it's never, well, sometimes it's easy, but sometimes it's an incredible struggle. I've probably done 50 drawings today. I still haven't presented the building. I know what I'm chasing, but it's not falling into place. And I think one of the hardest things in architecture is knowing when it has fallen into place. Not doing a design. I think, there are some brilliant architects around who do designs in a day or a week, and be quite convincing about those designs. I can't do that. I always ask the clients to give us time to ensure that what we present is what we believe in.
Is there an ethical dimension to this? Is there an ethical effect of this process, I suppose, is the clearest way I want to ask that question. Do you feel that there is in some way, an obligation, not just in your own work, but for architects to operate in this way? And I'm not asking, do you want to be an evangelist? Do you want to be a missionary?
No.
I'm asking simply, I guess, do you think that this is the way architecture should be done?
No, don't. I don't assume that whatsoever. It's the only way that I can do it responsibly and creatively. In terms of ethical, that's a very personal thing. Your ethics are very personal, and so all I can ever describe is my personal ethics, my moral standing, my moral courtesy, and then from that stems a way of thinking and right or wrong. I mean, the other thing in all this is that when we launch into these processes some 40 years ago, we're taking a huge risk. There's no evidence that it's going to be correct. There's no evidence that the outcome will be okay. You know, sure, you have some reference points, but they're different people and different times and different energy and different values in many cases. So you do take these steps as a child learning to walk, really. Your confidence is not profound.
No.
Quite the opposite. It's exploratory. So ethics, I find, are a very personal thing. And I know that you mentioned ethics several times. And I think that ethics and ethos are fundamental to architecture. And I respect that. And I respect work that is nothing like the work we do. For its when it's intelligent work, it's incredible. I've walked into buildings that bear no reference to or little reference to where they are, but huge reference to inspiration and people. And I'm challenged and blessed by those. But I can't practice like that.
No.
And it would be incorrect for me to attempt it.
Yeah. That's very...
And also it's a thing about time too, you know, the time that we're in and owning that time. We're in a particular time in the sequence, in the ballet of life. How do we grow within that time, and how do we relate? We're not 50 years ago and we're not 50 years beyond. We're right here. And so, you know, there are certain problems that exist in the world right now. And one of them, of course, is climate. So the buildings can't just be dancing with the landscape. They've got to understand their companions, like their weather patterns and what they're disturbing and what they're changing. And can that change be education, or is it going to be something else? Whereas I think in 50 years' time, it'll be a whole different scenario.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, I admit, I freely, and it's quite nice to have it pointed out that I often bring up this issue around ethics. I suppose, in my defense, I grew up in the architecture world of the early 2000s, where there seemed to me to be an increasing absence of this idea of an ethic in architecture, that it became, around the millennium, frivolous in many ways. And I found it very uncomfortable. It wasn't why I started studying architecture. So I'm kind of interested to see and find people whose work embodies a kind of, as you put it most beautifully, a moral courtesy.
I think it's a wonderful preoccupation, ethics, in terms of the discussion, in terms of evolution of thinking, in terms of personal wealth, not physical wealth, but personal wealth. I think I'm joining with you in the celebration of ethics. And when I read it, I went and looked it up to make sure or ensure that I was talking about the same thing as yourself.
Mm.
And it's, like I say, I think, a fundamental word in any creative outlet, ultimately.
Yeah. How do you feel your work has been inflected over time? This is not one of the questions that I put to you. I guess it is perhaps the last question I put to you. How do you feel that your engagement with indigenous forms of knowledge have inflected this process? And I ask this because, to me, this process that you describe in your work is very cosmological. It's very other. It's very numinous. It's about trying to grasp the mysterious and ineffable qualities of place. It sort of seems rooted in a Norberg Schultz idea of genius loci, but it seems to move beyond that as well. Do you feel that idea of indigeneity, that idea of that connectivity to land that we understand Aboriginal peoples to have had, contra modernist ideas, has been effective on your work?
For whatever reason, and I can't put my finger on it, I always felt comfortable in the company and knowledge of Indigenous people. And it wasn't to do with verbal communication, it was to do with emotional and spiritual communication. And this is from the age of, my grandmother used to take food parcels to the Aboriginal settlements in Sydney, which was a very uncommon thing for a white person to do in those days, 1940s. And in a way, I inherited something of that. My uncle left to be a missionary in Papua New Guinea almost the week I was born. And so I've always had this sort of secondary guidance or discussion going on around people with thinking that goes back thousands and thousands of years. And I've always felt really comfortable with that. I haven't ever been disturbed by it. And whereas I have been disturbed by current thinking and current values, I have found some of those disorientating. So I did my final year thesis on Aboriginal people in Australia and how they occupied the land. I went to Papua New Guinea for a couple of years and studied the Longhouse and lived with highland people and documented the buildings. I hitchhiked through Africa and stayed in villages. And then I met the most influential elder who took me under his wing, really, and quietly, he was the fellow I talked about, my teacher's nature, and quietly and simply guided my process within culture, within white and Indigenous culture. Not in a dogmatic way and not in a dominant way and not in a constant way. Sometimes we'd only meet 4 or 5 times a year. But when we did, it was always incredibly meaningful and beautifully orchestrated by he. So I think, number one, that comfort is very important, because once you recognize that comfort, you can take on knowledge a lot easier because you're respectful of it. So you take it on a lot easier. And then we formed a foundation several years, nearly 10 years ago, and we started work in favelas in Brazil. And then when COVID hit, we were blessed by a phone call that came through and said, would you do some work, some pro bono work for communities, Aboriginal communities in Western Australia, in remote places, some of the most remote places in the world. And we've been doing that for the last 4 or 5 years. And that has been prophetic, because I am a lot older and a lot more able to see the picture and put the puzzle together, in a constructive way that understands some of the things that are much deeper than a conversation about politics. A really good example that I cited recently and suddenly realised how important it was I was due to meet an elder, and he travelled from Perth up to Newman, which is a mining town, and we'd been there for a day waiting for him, and he turned up, and he went straight to his room, and we were deliberately there to meet this fellow, traditional elder, and anyway, we had dinner, but he didn't join us. Got up in the morning, he had breakfast by himself, and we travelled all day to the community, which is about 12 hours by car. And I was in his car, and he did not say a word to me. That night, he went to his own accommodation, which I must say was, not salubrious at all. And we got up the next morning and caught up again, and he still hadn't talked to me. So we're talking, that's like 2 days now. That night, I was sitting next to him by a fire, and the night sky overhead, beautiful sky, no moon, so full of stars, breathtaking. And he just looked over at me, he said, nice of you to come. And we started a conversation, and which went on into the night. And at some point, I felt comfortable enough to say to him, why haven't you talked to me for like nearly 3 days? I've got to go tomorrow. We've had so little time together. He said, I was just getting to know you. I mean, so different to how we operate as people.
Mm.
And that, in a funny way, typifies the difference in how we educate ourselves and what our priorities are in that education. And it's being magnified today with the computer. What we're doing now is incredibly convenient and worthwhile, but it's not all like that. It's the whole thing about, when the hammer was invented, it saved time and it was wonderful. But you could also hit your finger and bloody give yourself a sore thumb, for 3 weeks. There are pluses and minuses to everything, and they're very important to recognise. So not as a consequence, but as a respect to how I understand or how I view people of the land. I try and respect the land that I do buildings on. I just try my best to do that, so that every building has a logical explanation. And it's a wonderful process, because it can be creative. It can be exceptional. It doesn't have to be prosaic, it doesn't have to be sort of so logical it's mathematical.
No.
It can be incredibly poetic. And of course, anything can, but something with logic that's poetic is quite incredible.
Do you feel that poetry comes more particularly from this synthesis between both an understanding of the landscape and a sensitivity towards the folk that live there, the people that live there?
Absolutely.
And I ask that because I wonder how this works in contexts where you're in a very urban environment that's been urban for a long time, that the markers of the landscape, of the topography, have become very obscured, or you're working with a community that doesn't have even a medium length connection to the ground.
We were in Hyde Park in London once, and we decided we'd follow the old creek line down to the Thames, and it came out near Westminster Cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
And through that journey, which was half a day in its entirety, we then were able to map the city as an old city and work out why that low-lying area was an area of ill health. I forget the name of the area now, but there's a low-lying area adjacent to the river. And one could have almost drawn the topography of that city. And every city has an origin, and every city has a sort of foundation, and it grows logically, traditionally logically from that. In Sydney, our buildings are only first generation. So, the ability to find the landscape is not as difficult as it would be in Europe. But we did a building in Japan and one in Russia, and finding the landscape was a lot more walking and a lot more questions and a lot more time, but you can uncover it. I've found to date, I haven't ever been in a situation where it's been irretrievable. And we always have the sky and we always have the land.
It's true, we do. I guess this is a fairly tender question. Your architecture seems to me, or the way you're certainly describing it and how it appears to me in media, seems to kind of pursue an idea of authenticity. I think that was a word I wrote down when you were talking earlier. It was kind of a desire to be authentic, which I think is a very elegant kind of desire, motivation. Are there complexities and tensions thrown up by a middle-class white man like yourself, engaging with cultures which are not our own, so as to embed that learning, that knowledge in our work? I mean, that's a very controversial question, very challenging question.
No, it's not a controversial question. It's a very reasonable question. And I don't think someone with my background can ever expect to walk with the same abilities that an Indigenous person has. But my starting point is respect. And I think that's when you start, if that's your starting point, then the other things fall into their rightful place, which is not the ability to spear a wallaby. It's the ability to understand why it's necessary. And the wonderful, my uncle, who lived in a village for 36 years, when he finally came back to Australia, he said, I've been there for 36 years, but I'm still a foreigner. And that's we can move into other cultures and we can, depending on their overlap, we can inherit their patterns. But our best pattern is ourself, and whatever that means, and that really, I know it's commonplace, but that really is the discovery. And so I've been incredibly blessed with the guidance I've been given by all sorts of people. But the guidance by my Aboriginal friends, and Aboriginal is a general term for any Indigenous people in any country, has been very stabilizing and very very easy to work with. I mean, there are aspects of it, like the spiritual aspect is challenging, but I mean, I appreciate it. But the day to day is so refined that it creates its own particular beauty, because you don't have to anticipate it, because it's going to happen. It's going to be there. And so in a parallel way, I'd like to think that when you look at our buildings, you look at them and for some reason you just feel comfortable about it. You almost accept it without rhyme or reason. I was presenting to a client yesterday, and he said, "I'm not sure what it is about your invisible house, but for me it just makes sense." And that's a reasonably radical house, but it makes sense to I'd say a conservative client. And so if you can create a world of fascination in your work and yet also make sense, then the words around you are song lines. They're connected. They're making music.
It's a really interesting idea that rather than the architect as a kind of ambivalent and extracted scientist operating, you seem to be suggesting that both the architect and their architecture become implicated in the story of the site, become mediators of this world and our experience of it.
Mediators is a very strong word. And I would probably say the work becomes a means of connection, so that as you find out, or as you find the work, you also find yourself becoming of the work. Not in a way that you copy it or that it necessarily makes sense. Well, necessarily makes sense to you, but in a way that allows you to relax and perhaps even not be judgmental, perhaps to take it with you as part of your entourage.
It's a completely alternative way of talking and thinking about architecture, which I think is particular to Australian architects that I've spoken with. It's like an emergent new way of thinking about the world and our business of architecture.
Well, hopefully it's a responsible way of thinking, and it's not very important. It is informative to know that, from the age of, since I could walk, I've been climbing trees and chasing lizards, and I mean, that's been my life. And that has never changed in any way, in any way been over civilized. I'm still going out to the farm. I'm still in the ocean. I'm still walking the landscape. So that education continues and that practice continues. So the talk is not frivolous. It's actually coming from, if we were to sit around a fire, that it would get deeper. It's coming from honesty, really. And that's how I started with the conversation with you. And I'm learning that more and more as time goes on, as I get older. I mean, I'm getting quite old now.
And is there in your design, when you design, is there a paring back process? Do you design things and then have to pare it back, or is it pared back in its? Does this lead to an intuitive paring back?
You just never know. As I said before, the most heroic thing I've learned to do, or I've learned to appreciate, is when it's right. That's the tough thing, Like I haven't done 50 drawings on a job for 2 or 3 years. Been producing outcomes quite quickly that I'm delighted with. But this one, for some reason, I think it's the complication of the place. It's a very, very demanding place to be in. And so it requires a very elemental solution to be there. It can't be a complicated solution, otherwise you'll confuse the place. We walked up on the headland adjacent to this place and stood there, and all you needed to do was stand in the landscape to be grounded. So somehow I've got to take that into this complexity of 2 riverfronts and an ocean.
Good luck.
Yeah, thanks, mate.
Peter, thank you so very much.
That's okay. Thanks for asking.
It's been too long since I sat on granite in my country and thought. Perhaps a bit obvious here, but that's the first 2 lines of Country Speaks by Janine Leanne, and it's beautiful. Thanks to Peter for giving me the time of day. Thanks to Gabrielle for patiently enabling this, fielding all emails and supplying all material, and even the good man himself into my hands. See the podcast description for links to Peter Stutchbury Architects and to a wonderful book by Ewan McCoyne, Under the Edge, The Architecture of Peter Stutchbury, published by Thames and Hudson in 2016. And thanks for listening.